Use the teleport button to move forward into the chapel. Depending on your controller configuration, you can adjust the direction you'll be facing when you teleport, as shown by the arrow on the floor. Feel free to move around during your tour to get a better vantage point. Go ahead and try this now. We will begin shortly. You are standing in a virtual recreation of the Sistine Chapel. You have just walked through the entrance and are experiencing the work as the artist intended. This is how it was first seen by the people of Rome in December 1512. In our time, roughly 20,000 tourists a day are herded through this room, entering from a small door on the altar wall and exiting through a side door that will be installed in the 19th century. It is overwhelming. The mind reels. It's hard to focus on any one thing as you crane your neck and succumb to sensory visual overload. It was the German poet Goethe who said, "Until you have seen the Sistine Chapel, you can have no adequate conception of what one man is capable of accomplishing." Above you is over 6,000 square feet of painted fresco, largely created by one man. A man who didn't even want this job. Michelangelo Buonarroti, at age 33, was considered the greatest living sculptor after his creation of statues like the Pietà and the David. Some considered him the greatest living artist, period. One of these admirers was Pope Julius II. His uncle, Sixtus, had built this very chapel that bears his name when he was pope. At the time, the ceiling above you was covered in bright blue ultramarine paint with thousands of small gold stars. Pope Julius decided that he would add to his uncle's chapel and decorate its ceiling. He convened his Vatican artists to devise a plan. The artists, namely Donato Bramante, realized that this was going to be an extremely difficult task. He told Julius that he should award the ceiling commission to Michelangelo, the young sculptor from Florence. If he was indeed the greatest artist of our time, he would have no problem completing this commission. Unfortunately for Michelangelo, but fortunately for us, the Pope was convinced. All Bramante and his artist friends had to do was sit back and watch Michelangelo fail. Michelangelo pleaded with the Pope. He was a sculptor, not a painter. He had no experience painting fresco, but the Pope didn't care. So Michelangelo fled Rome, and the Pope sent an envoy to hunt him down and bring him back. When he refused, the ambassador said he would either decorate the Pope's ceiling or risk the invasion of Florence, his hometown. Needless to say, back then you didn't say no to the Pope. The ceiling above you took 4 years to complete, from 1508 to 1512. This includes a brief meltdown in the middle where he again fled and again was brought back under guard by armed papal soldiers. During this time, Michelangelo painted the entire ceiling you see, everything from the top of the windows up. Let me remind you, it took Leonardo 6 years to complete this, which I'm placing here at actual size. Seriously. Michelangelo was originally commissioned to paint the 12 apostles over the windows, and some elaborate geometric designs above their heads filling the vault. This was a Herculean task, not just painting a huge curved vault 70 feet off the ground, but dealing with ever-changing sightlines that, from the floor, presented almost impossible problems of perspective and foreshortening. Michelangelo was not one to be intimidated by difficulties. He preferred them, sought them out, at times even created them. He told the Pope that the existing plan was boring, and he would come up with something new. If he was going to do something, he was going to own it. So here's this young guy who doesn't want the job, who isn't trained to do the job, but reluctantly accepts the commission and then decides to completely alter it to an unheard of level of ambition never before seen, not even in antiquity. So Michelangelo decides that the chapel as it exists now, with its Quattrocento frescoes on the walls depicting the lives of Moses and Christ, what is missing is everything that came before. He will literally paint biblical Genesis surrounded by the Old Testament prophets and pagan Greek symbols who foretold the coming of Christ. In the four corners, he will depict Old Testament Jewish heroes overcoming their enemies. He painted over 300 figures encased in this fictional painted architectural scheme, the first of its kind, that serves to unify and harmonize everything into a single coherent cosmic whole. Unsure of himself, Michelangelo had assembled a team of experts to help him. He started right above where you entered the chapel, painting the Great Flood and the prophet Zechariah. After having painted Zechariah, which is believed to be a portrait of Pope Julius himself, the Pope was very pleased. He said it was a superb work and that Michelangelo could decorate the rest of the chapel in any manner he wished, effectively silencing disgruntled papal scholars alarmed at his plan to decorate their most holy chapel with pagan images. The Vatican artists, upon seeing this portrait, ridiculed Michelangelo, saying that he did not know foreshortening or perspective, that he was essentially a fool. I'd like you to take a minute to look down the room at Jonah, who caps the other end of this vault. He leans backwards in his throne, but the vault is actually curving forwards. He stretches his legs out into the real space of the chapel. He and Haman to his left are two of the most virtuoso examples of foreshortening in the history of art. But let's get back to the flood. The scaffold had been disassembled, and viewing it from the ground for the first time, Michelangelo was very disappointed. Here, he had hired the best fresco painters in Italy, and under their guidance, he had created figures that were hardly discernible from the floor. He started to doubt himself. Perhaps Bramante and the others were right. Never one to waste energy on confrontation, though, he arrived the next morning and locked everyone out. Save for a few Florentine friends to aid him with preparations, he would do the rest himself, and the doors would remain locked. You'll notice that from here down the vault, the figures become larger. They all exist in 3 dimensions, as though they are occupying space amid the marble architecture. This is a sculptor painting. There are no lush environments or backgrounds, no incidental details whatsoever. These are massive giants, looming figures that demand our attention as individuals. Let's go over the central flattened section of the vault. What's depicted are the first 9 verses of Genesis, starting at the altar wall with God separating light from darkness and ending above you with the drunkenness of Noah. This is the biblical narrative, painted in reverse order, from sin to salvation. You have the fall of Noah, and you follow this back across 3 organized groups, portraying Adam and Eve and God creating the earth. Remember, the guy hesitant to paint 12 apostles has now decided to depict the creation of the entire universe. Notice this large marble fence erected on the floor, the transept. It was meant to divide members of the Vatican from the visiting faithful. If you look up, see how this feature divides the biblical narrative. God is only portrayed on the liturgical or Vatican side and does not cross over into the lay area of the room to mingle with us common folk. Flanking the biblical histories are the giants we spoke of, the Old Testament prophets and pagan sibyls who foretold the coming of Christ. They are superhumans that exist on a plane between God and the lower figures surrounding them. Those figures, in the triangular spandrels and rainbow-shaped lunettes above each window, are the ancestors of Christ. These are some of the most profoundly human images ever painted. This concludes our brief orientation. Now that you have your bearings, the trigger on the control in your hand will allow you to inspect figures and elements on the ceiling. When one is highlighted, press the trigger to start or stop hearing information about that selected item. You can move freely around the floor of the chapel, or select the aerial work platform in the corner to hop in and take a closer look like a Vatican conservator. To learn more about the creation of the Sistine ceiling, select the wooden scaffold in the opposite corner. We hope you enjoy this experience as much as we enjoyed making it. These Quattrocento frescoes were painted when Michelangelo was a young boy, completed by some of the most famous early Renaissance artists in Italy. As I mentioned before, they depict the life of Moses and Christ and existed here when he began the ceiling project. Michelangelo put a lot of thought into how his work above would tell the tale of everything that came before. This experience isn't really about these frescoes on the walls, but if you click them, I'll tell you the title of the piece and the artist who created it. These 20 figures of nude young men, the Ignudi, are seated above the prophets and sibyls, one layer closer to God, and represent wingless angels, the ideal human figure. They adorn the architecture, positioning those medallions in place along with massive sacks of acorns. Oak being the symbol of the Della Rovere family, which means of the oak, this is the house of Julius and Sixtus, the popes we spoke of earlier. This is the sacrifice of Noah, depicted as Noah, his wife and family sacrificing 2 rams. So the sacrifice was to thank God for protecting them in the deluge. It's a bit out of order on the ceiling, but I'm sure Michelangelo wanted to save the larger panel for the flood. I do find it odd that he's saved 2 of every animal on the ark, and then the first thing that he and his family does is sacrifice a bunch of them, lining them up for the slaughter. I feel this is summed up best in the facial expression of the ox in the background left. That there is some 21st century meme material. You've clicked on one of the prophets or pagan Greek sibyls. During the Renaissance, there was a rekindled interest in classical art, but also classical ideas. There was a newborn fascination with pre-Christian religions, and while this was an exploration of pagan symbolism, it was often shoehorned into somehow supporting Christianity as the only true religion. The Hebrew prophets and Greek sibyls both spoke on behalf of a god, and some of their prophecies did foretell the coming of a savior, so that kind of worked. The sibyls' geographical names reveal the range of their mission. If you look up, Greece is represented by the Delphic sibyl, Ionia and Asia by the Eritrean and Persian sibyls, Africa by the Egyptian or Libyan sibyl, and Rome in the center by the sibyl from Cumæa. Michelangelo interleaved them with the prophets to create an incredibly strong unifying visual theme. It should be noted that no artist had previously put the sibyls on equal footing with the prophets like this. To better understand the images Michelangelo used, one must understand his influences, and the fiery Florentine preacher Savonarola was chief among them. I say fiery because he was a dramatic orator, but also because the Vatican burnt him alive for disagreeing with them. In one of his most famous sermons, Savonarola cited the 7 divine forces of the Holy Spirit from the prophecy of Isaiah: wisdom and understanding, deliberation and might, science and compassion, and above all, fear of the Lord. The celebrated art historian Edgar Wendt was the first to notice that these align in order with the 7 prophets on the ceiling. Zechariah represents wisdom, Joel, intelligence, Isaiah, deliberation, Ezekiel, might, Daniel, science, Jeremiah, compassion, and Jonah, fear of the Lord. The figures are also arranged in an order that complements one another. Jonah's defiant turbulence calls for its complement in the peace of Zechariah. Daniel and the Eritrean sibyl are both gifted in interpretation, though one in science and one in tongues. Ezekiel and Cumæa are the most powerful figures on the vault. Seated in the center, they anchor everything with their power and stability. You can now inspect individual figures to learn more about them. Above you is a recreation of the original wooden scaffold, designed by Michelangelo. He was an amazing architect, creating, amongst other things, the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, which is still the tallest dome ever built. He created the scaffold in a way that allowed him to move and extend it along these wooden beams resting on the wall cornice. This was such a pragmatic design that 500 years later, the team that set out to restore the ceiling actually recreated this exact same scaffold to do their work, but out of steel this time. Hold on, we're going to teleport up onto the scaffold where you can take a look. For 4 years, Michelangelo lived up here. He had assistants bring and mix paint, prep plaster. He ate here. He no doubt spent many nights sleeping on this scaffold. He had special candles that let off minimal smoke made of animal fat so that the wax burnt instead of dripping. I guess that's kind of important when you have one tied to your head. Take a moment to reach up and pretend to paint something above you. Your neck is probably already aching from looking up the past few minutes. Now think about painting like this day after day for 4 years. We not only know how long Michelangelo spent on the scaffold, we know the exact order in which he painted the ceiling, down to how much work he accomplished in a single day. How do we know this? Because in order for pigments to bind to fresco for all eternity, in order for the colors to become part of the stone, you have to paint plaster while it's wet. This is a huge time constraint to something that's already stressful enough. The amount of wet plaster you can paint in a day is called a giornata, and these giornata, or individual sections of plaster, could be seen when inspecting the ceiling closely. Take a look above you at the creation of Adam. It's 16 giornata in total. Let's look at the plaster sections. Sampling how the plaster of each section overlaps with the previous, we know the exact order these sections were painted. Let's fade in each section as he painted it in those 16 days. If I had the time, I could do this for every inch of the ceiling. We could fade in each day's work, starting above the door where you entered, and progressing over the entire ceiling in the exact order he painted it, all the way to the altar wall, and then finally the lunettes. We have so much detailed insight into the time and anguish he spent up here, largely because of this letter, a poem that he sent to a friend. In it, he describes the working conditions and even sketched himself painting the ceiling in the margins. I will leave you with this, his own words, but you can click on the floor at any time to head back down. I've grown a goiter from this torture, hunched up here like a cat in Lombardy, or anywhere else where the water's a stagnant poison. My stomach squashed under my chin, my beard's pointing at heaven, my brain's crushed in a casket. My breast twists like a harpy's. My brush, above me all the time, dribbles paint onto my face and makes a fine floor for the droppings. My haunches are grinding into my guts. My poor ass strains to work as a counterweight. Every gesture I make is blind and aimless. My skin hangs loose below me. My spine's knotted and folding all over itself. I'm bent taut as a Syrian bow. Because I'm stuck like this, my thoughts are crazy, perfidious tripe. Anyone shoots badly through a crooked blowpipe. My painting is dead. Defend it from me, Giovanni. Protect my honor. I am not in the right place. I am not a painter. This is the cantoria, or choir box. It's where the Sistine Chapel choir sits and sings hymns. You can teleport up to see the chapel as only they have, and I mean that. Very few people have entered the cantoria. This is the handing over of the tablets of the law by Rosselli. These bronze medallions continue the story from Abraham to the Book of the Maccabees from the Apocrypha. It's believed that Julius wanted to draw a direct connection between himself, the warrior pope, and those warrior priests of the Old Testament. However, it should be said that Michelangelo probably didn't paint these, and they didn't seem like much of a priority. It looks like he even let go whomever was in charge of painting them towards the end of the project. You can see that the last few are in an unfinished state, and then the last one is just completely empty. And he was right. We really don't care. I mean, you probably wouldn't have noticed unless I had just pointed it out. Here, painted at the same time as the Quattrocento frescoes below them, are 28 predecessors to Pope Sixtus, each tucked away in his own false niche. Because the primary function of the chapel was to be the room where cardinals would elect a new pope, I suppose it made sense to have someone paint a history of popes. That said, these guys are easily the least photographed and discussed items in this room. These cherubs, referred to in Italian as putti, or by Michelangelo as termini, hold up the lintels and create a strong architectural frame around the prophets and sibyls. In the faux architecture, they project out very far away from the plane of the ceiling, almost as far as the prophets and sibyls themselves. There are 48 putti in total. Each prophet and sibyl is framed with a pair to each side. Each pair were created by mirroring 12 distinct cartoons or drawings. In each pair, there is a male and female cherub. Though male putti were common in Renaissance painting, it was very rare to depict a female. There are actually only 2 other known cases in all Renaissance art up until this moment. So here, once again, Michelangelo broke with tradition in his inclusion and portrayal of women.